Hello. Welcome to another episode of Season 16 of the Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a love for scary movies. In each episode, we both watch the same movie on our own and then record a conversation together about what we liked, what we hated, if we were scared, and maybe even some larger truths about why people watch horror movies in the first place. This season, the theme is B movies for C students. We're taking a break from the current trends toward elevated horror and examining the history of horror B movies and how they've developed over time. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the episode. You know, something weird that occurred to me about this week's movie?
What's that?
So, we've been going through B movies and the history of B movies, and we started in the 1920s, I think, or 30s, whichever it was, and are working our way towards the 2020s. And we've gone chronologically. And then last season was all about horror movies of the 90s, which means we have not watched a horror movie more recent than 1999 this year.
Ooh, that's crazy to think about, man.
Yeah, I mean, like, I definitely have on my own, but, like, we haven't talked about one.
Right,
so
not for the pod.
It's just a crazy feeling, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like we're on the precipice of new and exciting territory that we will get into next week. But for this week, we have one last movie from the 90s, and you picked this one.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, I feel like I'd seen the movie poster for this at least a billion times, but I never knew what the movie was.
That's why I picked it, because I've seen that movie poster a billion times.
Yeah,
that was specifically
crazy, right?
it. Like, I was going through a list, and, like, we ended up having to rent this one, but we had a really nice streak on Tubi. And I was sitting there trying to find, like, I had a bunch that I was wanting to do, and they weren't, some you couldn't even rent. And I was just like, okay, we'll just do this one, move on, go to the next. I was bamboozled.
Yeah, I think this one must have been for rent in one of the video stores in our hometown when we were kids, right? Like,
sure.
That's the only explanation for how ingrained this movie poster was in my brain. But yeah, and I did not know what to expect going into this. Mm-hmm. And the fact that it was directed and co-written by Peter Jackson blew my mind.
Yeah.
Like, how has it not come up before that he had this movie on his resume, you know?
Well, so one of the reasons why I picked it was specifically that, because I just thought it'd be funny to recommend someone a Peter Jackson film, and they're like, oh, Lord of the Rings, you know, it's like, no, Dead Alive. You ever heard of it?
Yeah, so for anybody that doesn't know, he would go on to direct the Lord of the Rings trilogy in the early 2000s, which was wildly successful. He also did the King Kong reboot in 2005, which was kind of successful. And then he did all the Hobbit movies in the 2010s. And so not a lot to say there other than I think we've completely made the transition from, like, B movies are just like the afterthought that Hollywood makes so they can package them as a 2-for-1, to B movies are a thing that the poor low budget movie houses make to sell to Hollywood, to B movies are making independent distribution things, but they're kind of looked down on and outside the Hollywood system, to now B movies can be their own thing. Independent distribution is its own thing. There's no real, like, career limitation by starting there, and you can go from finding your beginnings in that to being at the absolute, like, height of the Hollywood system. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting to see the way that this is all kind of, like, changed over time, but it's just now the lines are getting the blurriest they've ever been, I think, kind of between, like, B movies and non-B movies.
Yeah, so one of the things I was wanting to do was try to find like B movies that had, you know, actors that started out here and then, you know, went and kind of blew up. I didn't initially, like, go that route when I figured it was Peter Jackson doing this, because it's, you know, basically the same concept. But then the other thought, I know that we've talked about, like, wanting to watch, like, a horror movie from, like, every country or something, you know. So it's like, oh, this is New Zealand. I like their humor. like Flight of the Conchords stuff. So we should, or dry humor. So it should be good. There was not any famous people that I know of here, but that's for another week.
Yeah, and I think we've seen plenty of examples of that otherwise, where we've seen some very early performances by people who would go on to become very well known as we've gone through this season.
It's amazing too, because it's 90% of them are all like nose surgery, like actors and actresses.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. You mentioned the idea that this one was from New Zealand and it was set in New Zealand, and that was like kind of a big part of it. This film was also co-produced by the New Zealand Film Commission, which, much like Telefilm Canada, which we discussed during our episode on David Cronenberg's The Brood, is a government agency that was put in place to encourage the development of national films. So this is another case where a filmmaker with a vision was able to get funding, make their movie, and then get distribution all outside the Hollywood system. And it's interesting to me that we've come across like multiple cases where some countries actually have a government department to support that. And so I don't know, I guess just like outside the US, they didn't have this huge Hollywood industry to kind of like trailblaze and advance the technology and have a bunch of used equipment that other people could buy at a discount or something. But it's interesting to think about the idea that there is like a government agency that is helping to develop and fund these films, and that these are the types of films that they would greenlight.
That's the piece right there. The fact that the type of films that we've watched blows my mind. That first, I think it shows the appreciation for the arts. No matter which way you skin this cat, these are there is art involved with them, and so I think it's just cool to see a government supporting things like that too. It blows my mind, because you're just like, holy shit, I did not see that coming.
Yeah. And it also made me a little curious about the United States. And apparently the Department of Defense does have an entertainment media office, but it sounds like it's mostly only there to like help movies that make the military look good get made.
Yeah.
So like it's very American, and I guess like our tax dollars paid for Zero Dark 30, New Zealand's tax dollars paid for Dead Alive, and David Cronenberg's ex-wife's tax dollars paid for The Brood.
A couple Baptists paid for it.
Yeah, right. So yeah. Anyway, this one was a lot of fun. We have a ton to talk about, but first I'll do a quick introduction, and then we'll get into the... if you really stop to think about it, Uncle Les was by far the most disturbing part of this movie, wasn't he? Details. In 1992, Trimark Pictures brought us Dead Alive, a zombie splatter comedy horror from New Zealand. Originally released as Brain Dead in New Zealand, this movie was made by an up-and-coming comedy horror director named Peter Jackson. Whatever happened to that guy? Anyway, this movie tells the story of a zombie apocalypse unleashed on a small New Zealand town after a bewitched rat monkey gets smuggled out of Sumatra and into a local zoo. As often happens. This movie was made on a budget of $3 million, but only made about $250,000 at the box office in the US. It has, however, gone on to attract a cult following and holds a place near the top of the ranks of the goriest films of all time. It can currently be rented for streaming on Amazon Prime Video. I feel like this movie was... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
First time Tubi ever let me down.
But it probably won't be the last.
No.
But it's still a good service. Yeah. I'm here for it. Yeah. Tubi being real good. You can go a long way.
As long as you're free.
Yep. This movie felt very inspired by Evil Dead. But also arachnophobia a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Like if you took out Jeff Daniels and added more blood, you can kind of see it, right?
Evil Dead did come out before this film. Yeah, 100% easily inspired by Evil Dead and arachnophobia, but for sure Evil Dead. My delay was just like, wait, what year did that come out? Yeah, even the second one came out before this one. Yeah. Holy shit.
And Arachnophobia might have been after, but I just the idea of like kind of the creature that gets loose and then starts attacking all the people, like, yeah. And then also, I feel like this one might have been like one decent actor away from being a little better, but
yeah,
we can't all have Jeff Daniels, okay?
Or John Goodman.
Yeah, I tell you. This movie did have a very classic B-movie opening, though. You had like the explorer and his guide who were trying to smuggle this rare monkey out of the mountains, and the Aboriginals don't want him to, and they start chasing him, and he gets away just barely, but then he gets bitten by the monkey, and then the guys just chop him up.
Yeah.
And then it goes just to the credits and kind of the normal story opening. And it reminded me a lot of some of those early B movies that we watched, like The Mask of Fu Manchu, where it's just like excitement, adventure, no backup, no real backstory or character development or anything. You're just right in the middle of it in some exotic location, and there's danger and everything's moving really fast. And I actually love that for a movie opening.
Yeah. It's almost like an action movie opening too. I feel like I thought of Indiana Jones when I saw the opening of this one.
Definitely.
For whatever reason. The third one. But anyway.
Yeah, and I think it was good that they opened that way, and then it ended with the very like violent scene, because that set expectations. And also, I don't know that I would have kept watching this movie if it just opened straight with the whole Lionel Paquita flirting storyline. Yeah, because that was rough and not interesting.
And this movie also had one of my favorite things from 90 films. It had a pretty decent like soundtrack from the point of view of like, it was almost like maybe like one of those like PG-13 movies that I would have watched that maybe were for kids, but technically adults from the 90s. It really reminded me of that. And I feel like that is anytime you have a soundtrack that's almost like a little whimsical and in certain spots, I'm going to be a fan of it just from that alone.
Yeah, it was definitely not a traditional horror movie soundtrack at all. It was kind of more like almost rom-com,
right,
or something. The soundtrack seemed like it did not take itself super seriously.
Yeah, 100%. But I mean, the whole film itself, as well. And yeah, I think one thing with this, like, this feels like a movie that would be played on within a movie that we watched. So that they're watching a movie, this is one. And I feel like that has to be a common thing. And one of the things is like, how do you get away with this being one of them? And it's like, can you make it where it's so violent? Can you make the special effects look so gnarly, but obviously fake? And does that make it okay as to like why you can put it out to, put it on TV or whatever for the ratings? I don't know where I'm getting at with that, but it definitely felt like this was one of those films. It definitely felt like it was a Halloween film as well, even though it was a little bit more humorous than expected. I would probably play this early October, not late October, just for the record. I'm starting to fine tune my October movie list, like fine wine. So,
yeah,
I'd pair this with the October 5th.
Yeah, I think that's a good recommendation. And this one, it had humor, but it was different than the humor we've seen in a lot of the other like B movies that we've watched, where it was just like one of the characters is over the top and trying too hard to be funny. This one was just like all gross out humor. So early on, the mom is getting ready and she accidentally pulls off part of her cheek after she's been zombified. And then Lionel is trying to like super glue it back on so that the members of the Women's League won't know that there's anything wrong, because that's, better than admitting it that they need help for some reason. And then that whole dinner scene with them where the mom's arm pus spews into the guy's custard and he eats it, and then like her ear falls into her custard and she eats it and stuff. And it's just like, I can just imagine the filmmakers just like giggling to themselves and like, oh, that's so gross the whole time, and like really just pushing each other for ideas to like one up how gross the previous scene was. And that didn't really land with me for a lot of the movie. Like, to me, that's just they're being goofy and seeing what they can get away with. It's not really like creating a horror environment. And I feel like they did the horror thing way better later on in the movie. So I was glad I stuck with it.
Yeah, I think, I definitely see what you're saying. I think it gets to a point where like it almost feels like we're watching a whole bunch of inside jokes between the cast. And,
yes,
right. You know, and it's like we're not in on these. Some of them are definitely funny, some of them are definitely not. Some of them are gross, you know, and like mission accomplished. But you're absolutely right, though. Like sticking through it, like it does. The element of horror with this is just like, I know it's almost like comical, but not almost. It is comical, but just like there was horror or something bad at like around every corner, towards 3/4 to or maybe halfway through the end of the film, especially in that house. Like anything was about to go bad that could.
Yeah.
However, there was one scene where the zombies are all eating at a table and the guy sticks the spoon like through his skull, like through his mouth, through his skull. Yeah. And I laughed at that because I was like, damn, that's pretty funny because they're all just fucking dumb. But
it was creative. I wouldn't have expected it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Like that whole sequence. And it was also creative too that he was using, like, I felt like this is the first like zombie film where they're like, hey, why don't we just put them to sleep? Like tranquilizer,
right.
So I thought that was pretty clever too.
Yeah.
Surprised it hadn't been used again, or more often.
Yeah, it felt like this one, they were just really throwing every idea they had out there, and some of them were better than others. And I think a really good contrast of that is there was the graveyard scene where after the mom gets buried and then Lionel's going to go out there to dig her up, and then there are the thugs and they beat him up and one of them starts pissing on his mom's grave, and then she comes out of the grave and attacks, and like the blood sprays everywhere and he gets thrown across the graveyard and stuff. And it was just like this really intense, like actual horror scene that was super gripping. And then all of a sudden the point where it lost me was that when the priest shows up and he's like, I kick ass for the Lord, and like kung fu's all the zombies. Like, yeah, it was kind of funny, but also why did we just like bail on the horror? You know what I mean? Yeah. It went a totally different direction at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, it was almost like the dinner scene, the zombies dinner scene, that's comical. But like that scene in the cemetery, like that was pretty pivotal. And you have this random priest coming out, like just doing karate for like a couple minutes, like nothing else. Like it just ends abruptly, and then he's just part of the zombies too. Yeah. I think, and out of nowhere, and it's like it was almost like we were on like the cusp of trying to make a like a mockumentary, or like a basically like we were on the cusp of, hey, let's just throw horror onto this, say it's a comedy horror, and it'll be fine. It was almost there. There was enough horror where it got away with it, but you're right. Like that scene, albeit it may have been funny to like or certain people, but it was like it just kind of takes it away from what that scene had to offer.
Yeah, and I think that in retrospect, the quirkiness of it makes sense why this would be kind of a cult classic, or why it would have a lot of people who are super into it. And I will say, like, it was a super creative movie for the time it really, I would imagine, pushed the boundaries and did a lot with the practical effects that were interesting and covered a lot of ground. And I can get why, if you were in like, I don't know, middle school or high school in the 90s and you happened to smuggle this VHS home, it would really have entertained you a lot. Just from like it almost reminds me of like, a Green Day or like an early Green Day or early Blink-182 album where they're just like, what can we get away with talking about on this that will piss off the parents? And I felt like this movie had a strong dose of that.
Yeah. And I think it's definitely cool. And it's definitely okay to do. And this is if you're going to do it, like they did it in the right realm of films, which is B movies. Like, I don't think that they were like coming out trying to be something that they weren't. And in a way, they were probably making fun of, it was probably commentary on some of their actual, favorites. But it could also have been a nod to Evil Dead, for sure, because it had the similar filming techniques for sure, as far as like zooming in on face and like the low angle up to the face zoom and, things like that. Like it maybe. Last week made me want to watch People Under the Stairs when we watched Castle Freak, and this one made me want to watch Evil Dead. And so it's not necessarily that bad, but it was just too similar. When we already have, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just saying that I like Evil Dead a lot. This one was good, and I think it kind of rode on that coattails, and that's probably why I think that. And it's like all the things I like. But it was just on the cusp of just being a little annoying.
So what I had as my summary at the end was that this was an absolutely amazing work of practical effects, and the splatter horror level. Like, I don't know that anything has matched this, just as far as what it did with the gore and the practical effects and everything that came along with it. However, most of the payoff was at the very end, and there was just way too much movie leading up to that didn't really matter a lot. Like, I think you could have totally cut out the backstory about like the baby and all the scenes associated with that, and it would have been a better movie. A lot of the romance with Paquita, I think you could have cut out, and it would have made it for a better movie. Like the whole ending part where they're trapped in the house after he accidentally gives the zombies the animal adrenaline or whatever that was also labeled as poison for some reason. Like, from that point forward, it was great. Like, everything in it was just like super intense. And then even the scene where Lionel shows up with the lawnmower in like a very Ash with a chainsaw manner, and then starts between the lawnmower and the blender, like things got gnarly. Like, it is a very, very memorable movie because of like those last pieces of it. And I don't think I've ever seen anything that gory, which is saying something at this point in how many horror movies we've watched. Yeah. But it just, so much of the journey to get there, I was like, I don't know what we're doing here. And there were a lot of like, what I keep coming back to, there were a lot of ideas with this one, a ton of ideas. They weren't always strung together well, and I feel like they weren't necessarily curated well. I think you could have cut out a decent chunk of this movie and the whole thing would have been stronger for it. But there was definitely enough to leave in to make up a full movie that would still be pretty remarkable.
Yeah, for as long as this movie was, like, it definitely felt longer than
it did. Yeah, for sure.
It felt very, very long to watch. Definitely very entertaining pieces. I think the thing I also kind of like is like, it seems like there's different styles of like over the top special effects with horror. Like, you have some that's just like straight, looks like red water that's shooting out of a limb. You have that kind. You have some that's like almost like a red gel blood that's happening, and like the skin's like more looks latexy, looks real. Like, it's cool to see those and the progression of those, and like how they'll eventually all kind of combine into each other. But yeah, I mean, I think there are better horror comedy films out there than this one. I think that Evil Dead did it really well, and if Evil Dead 2 on top of that came out before did it really well as well. But if this is just like an ode to it, you're a fan of those, and if you're a fan of Evil Dead, I think you'll probably like this one too. But yeah, just chill out with the long drawn out scenes that mean nothing. Like, we didn't need the tarot cards.
Yeah, right.
Like those, that's kind of fluff that you didn't necessarily need. It also, honestly, to me, kind of felt like maybe it was a whole bunch of like skits that were pieced together. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it was so, and you'll see that with certain films for sure. Like that's probably not that's not very uncommon. That's right.
Correct.
But with this one, it was just like, it wasn't cohesive enough to work. Someone probably wrote the dinner scene and they thought that was really funny, and then you had someone else write the super glue scene. Right. That was real funny, but then insert the baby piece, and you're like, where's this come from? It doesn't make sense. Like, is it supposed to make sense? But anyway, I could go on about that. At the end of the day, if you like Evil Dead, you'll like this one. More than likely.
Yeah, and I think that this one, like you were kind of saying before, thinking about it in terms of like, when would I watch this again? Having it on in the background while doing other stuff in the fall leading up to Halloween seems like the appropriate place for that. Like, I totally get seeing it once, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know that it would require a super close second watch until you got kind of more into the gnarly ending scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's for damn sure.
Also, Uncle Les, probably a serial killer.
Without a doubt.
Right? Like, he was way too comfortable pulling out teeth with pliers.
He was coming around because he wanted, like, the house or something, right? Wasn't that the case? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if Lionel didn't give it to him, he was going to take it. Yeah,
100%. He was just a greasy businessman with a
that's what you
wig.
thought. But yeah, then it's like, oh, no, this is Norman Bates.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. Anyway, the real dark side of Uncle Les came out as the movie went on, and that it got a little bit into, I thought it was going to take it further, but it got a little bit into that whole, when the zombies are outside, we think we're safe, but we find out that the people on the inside in this situation are the ones who are the most monstrous or whatever. There was a little bit of that in Uncle Les that I don't think we've gotten in some of the other early zombie movies, or like more, I guess, comedy horror zombie movies.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, not a lot to talk about there. Overall, this I feel like was a fitting end to our journey through B horror movies up through the 90s. And next week, we're going to be back with our first movie from the 2000s / first movie after the 90s that we've talked about in forever, it feels like. So I'm excited. I'm excited to see kind of as we make our way into the world, like post-Scream, where, on our way to elevated horror, and to see kind of what B movies are doing in the new millennium.
And technology is getting cheaper, so these smaller companies can definitely do more. So in the 2000s.
And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com, or hit us up on the IG. That's what the kids call Instagram. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.
I should have asked this before I started recording, but was your film based in New Zealand? The film you watched? Okay, thank God. I had like this, dude.
Oops.
I woke up at like 4 thinking like, because it goes by Dead Alive and it goes by Buried Alive or whatever. Like there's multiple names, and then there's also
Yeah,
like
Brain Dead.
Brain. Yeah, then there's another one out like, and I was like, like I woke up just thinking that I told you the wrong, and then I just didn't do anything about it all day until just now.
I now have it as a goal in the future, and I'm not going to tell you when, to recommend a movie to you that is slightly different than the one I plan on watching, but is like the same general plot, and then just seeing how long it takes us into the episode to figure it out.
Yeah. Wait a minute. Drew Barrymore's not in your film?
Yeah. Was that Drew Barrymore? I would have sworn it was Sandra Bullock.
She played the castle freak. She played Fred.
Right. Yeah.